Hello and welcome. This is a little review of Alexander Dugin's The Great Awakening versus The Great Reset, published and released in 2021. I'm not sure how I got the copy of this because I have a paperback copy. I thought all his work was banned. It's the only book that I could get on Amazon, and this is from Amazon. Well, it's Amazon UK, but I live in Ireland, so this is the kind of UK region. I've heard from friends in America that they can't even get a copy of this book, so I'm lucky to have at least one of his books in paperback. Anyway, so as the title of the book says, this is he's discussing this theme of the Great Reset. The Great Reset was, of course, coined, as he mentions, by Prince Charles in 2020 at the World Economic Forum. I think it's also kind of been used by Klaus Schwab, so it's a kind of, one of these World Economic Forum terms. So Dugin is really going to try to kind of define what this Great Reset is in its historical significance, and he's gonna oppose it to the Great Awakening. So we'll get into the Great Awakening a little bit later. But the Great Reset is, he gives this a very historical grounding. The Great Reset is basically, he thinks it was initiated with the victory of Joe Biden in the 2020 election, and the removal of, well, I suppose, I know this is like conspiracy theories over, was Trump really, was he cheated out of office or whatever? I'm not going to get into that. I don't know. But he, I think even if you throw that kind of conspiracy theory aside, you can definitely see that there was a time of immense propaganda and manipulation. I think the 2020 election of Joe Biden. No, I'm not saying the actual voting mechanisms. I don't know. People can discuss that in some other place. But the at least the sort of media and other forms of expressions of power, I think, with the lockdowns and so on, the weaponization of kind of panic, and we know from Twitter files, lots of more formal, mechanisms of censorship, and so on and so forth, that I think he kind of defined this in terms that I myself have been kind of thinking about over the past few years, which is this: the lockdowns onwards have kind of been a giant tantrum from the neoliberal post-war technocratic order, because it's being displaced by populism, and there's a very kind of reactionary. I don't mean reactionary in the left-right term. I just mean reactionaries in, like, reacting quite hostilely and aggressively to a kind of developmental, political, social developments which threaten your own interests and so on and so forth. So this is the sort of moment of the Great Reset. He will argue the Great Reset is both kind of domestic issues within the West regarding populism versus liberalism and so on, but it's also a reaction to geopolitical events, and these events have been going on for a few decades now, of an undermining of U.S. hegemony around the world. And this U.S. hegemony has always been connected to the expansion of liberalism around the world as well. So the Great Reset, you could say, is both is a reaction to increased opposition to the dominance of liberalism, and also the geopolitical switch from a kind of unipolar to a multipolar world. And he kind of describes new forms of censorship and control which have arisen in this reaction, and what he calls a kind of totalitarian phase of globalization. Dugin will argue that the, I suppose, evil, in his words, of contemporary kind of US centric liberalism and all of its kind of postmodern and post human expressions and tendencies is ultimately an expression of nominalism, which has gotten out of control. And for those who don't know, nominalism is a doctrine that there are no universals or general ideas. There's only names, they don't correspond to anything. There's just particular objects, particular things, particular objects, no universals. Dugin says, quote, nominalism laid the foundation for the future of liberalism, both ideologically and economically. Here humans were seen only as individuals and nothing else, and all forms of collective identity, religion, class, etc. were to be abolished. Likewise, the thing was seen as absolute private property, as a concrete, separate thing which could easily be attributed as property to this or that individual owner. Nominalism prevailed first of all in England, became widespread in Protestant countries, and gradually became the main philosophical matrix of a new age. In religion, individual relations of man with God; in science, atomism and materialism; in politics, preconditions of bourgeois democracy; in economy, market and private property; in ethics, utilitarianism, individualism, relativism, pragmatism, etc. The Great Reset, which I think he's saying is a kind of expression of the power, the political power of a kind of nominalist elite, nominalist thinking elite, we could say, it comes in three stages. The first is capitalism. The second stage is the triumph of liberalism over fascism and communism. And the third stage is this sort of post-human stage, which we're pretty much in now, or at least kind of sliding very quickly into. Within this last stage, the previous things which were declared not real, that we were supposed to liberate ourselves from, like family, religion, any sort of collective class as well, even any sort of collective sense of being and identity. The last stage is human, being a human itself. This is the kind of post-human liberation. He says, thus the last step for liberals who have traveled centuries toward their goal is to replace humans, albeit partially, by cyborgs, artificial intelligence networks, and products of genetic engineering. Next, Dugin will talk about the US, and I'll talk about Trumpism. And one thing about this little book is that it's quite internationalist. It's almost got that kind of Marxian, international spirit to it. He's really declaring a global conflict, and not just between different nations, but between things within those nations themselves, especially in the West, which are in conflict with each other, responding to the same thing. He sort of thinks that the Russian state, the Russian military in Ukraine, and the Russian state as a whole is responding to the same crisis which populists and other alternatives, kind of anti-liberal sentiments, are responding to within the West itself. So the first one he talks about here is Trumpism. And he'll actually describe populism as a sort of resistance to the metaphysics of liberalism and nominalism. But it's a sort of intuitive resistance to it. It sort of understands intuitively that there's something threatening coming, that we're entering a new phase, and that there's a need to resist, and there's a need to find an alternative. But of course, there is no obvious alternative, so we're kind of stuck with this vague, intuitive suspicion and hesitation and resistance. Often does lead to conspiracy theories, which he acknowledges, but he says that these are the kind of naive, or I think he uses the word infantile. These are kind of infantile, but still more or less kind of intuitively accurate understandings that there's something And he uses the language of the Antichrist and evil. There's something evil coming, or already here. And so populism is kind of described as a sort of messy but intuitive grasp of the situation. And he's not particularly critical of this. He thinks that this is an opening to something greater. He doesn't kind of dismiss this as, it's not coherent enough, it's not solid enough, doesn't have a kind of blueprint and a plan, and so forth. Obviously, this is all relatable to his work on the fourth political theory and so on. And I haven't read anything else other than the fourth political theory in this, so I won't pretend to be an expert on Dugin or anything. But Dugin seems to be very much he sees a kind of opening here. This fourth, right, isn't yet coherent. It's not solid. It's not hashed out. It's got no real long-term plan even. But it's an intuitive understanding of the situation which we can build upon. I think that would be his understanding of it. He'll talk a bit more about the kind of nominalistic desire to liberate ourselves from things. The progress of liberalism is basically to liberate the individual from all forms of collective identity. But then he'll argue that liberalism itself, that same push, that same drive, we could say, once it's liberated the individual from all collective identity, will then liberate us from the idea of an individual, and kind of because the individual is still bound by the idea that we are still human. And he'll talk a little bit more about conspiracy theorists, and he'll sum up the Great Reset as the following. He says, quote, "This is what all those taking up the fight against globalism and liberalism suspect, albeit very vaguely, although QAnon and their anti-liberal conspiracy theories only distort reality by lending suspect grotesque traits which liberals can easily refute. Reality, when described soberly and objectively, is far more frightening than its most alarming and monstrous premonitions. The Great Reset is indeed a plan for the elimination of humanity. For this is precisely the conclusion that the line of liberally understood progress logically leads to. Striving to free the individual from all forms of collective identity cannot fail to result in the freeing of the individual from himself." Dugin sort of discusses the lack of ideological coherence within populism somewhat positively. He says, this is why the thesis of the Great Awakening should not be hastily loaded with ideological details, whether fundamental conservatism, including religious conservatism, traditionalism, the Marxist critique of capital, or anarchist protesting for protesting's sake. The Great Awakening is something more organic, more spontaneous, and at the same time more tectonic. This is how humanity is suddenly being illuminated by the consciousness of the nearness of its imminent end. This is so interesting because, Dugin is not a Marxist. He's not somebody from the left, but he's trying to describe an opposition to liberalism, which isn't simply an expression of kind of a particular nation or a particular religion. You can think of radical Islam here as a resistance to liberalism, but it's not international anyway. It's specific to Islam. So he's trying to formulate this along the lines of, we could say, an opposition between what he calls actually the international of nations versus the international of elites. The international of nations, I think he's trying to imply a respect for national sovereignty against the force of globalization, but not a kind of provincial, particular sort of vulgar nationalism, something which sees the necessity of nationalism or of nations at least, as a bulwark to the threat of globalization. But at the same time, it's an international of nations, so it's a sort of a unification of people against this shared struggle against what he's calling the kind of imminent end of the human. It's actually quite a good book in terms of if you were to take everything else apart, and just focus in on his commentary of populism, it's quite a decent analysis of the potential of populism and what it is actually. He's actually the first person I've read who's positing a sort of coherent understanding of what populism is, what it's reacting to, its limits and its potentialities, and he does acknowledge its weaknesses in its vagueness and its lack of coherence. He does acknowledge that. But he says that in this vagueness and his lack of coherence, there's an opportunity for both left and right anti-liberal ideologies to give up on something which the left and the right haven't been able to give up on for a very, very long time. And that is the left-wing tendencies of anti-fascism, and that is the right-wing tendencies of anti-communism. These are two kind of tendencies, kind of hangover tendencies of anti-liberal thought, which I think it seems that he's arguing that this is perturbing, this is inhibiting a real resistance to liberalism, and I would fundamentally agree with that. I think that's a great point to make. I personally can't stand anti-fascism and anti-communism. Whenever I hear anti-fascist rhetoric from the left, I vomit. Whenever I hear it for anti-communist rhetoric from the right, I cringe. So vomiting and cringing is all I do when I hear this stuff. So that was actually really it was quite pleasant to look at some of his analysis of populism. He will then go on to talk a little bit about Islam against globalization and China. And, there's not a whole lot I can say about those sections. I think he's a bit naive about China. I think China has a more sinister role in all of this, personally. I think that, Russia's geopolitically now relying on a certain relationship with China, in which I think that some of his critiques of post-humanism should also be applied to. I could see Russia genuinely becoming a sort of anti-post-humanist sort of state, in a potentially positive way. I can't see the same thing with China. China, as it stands, seems to me to be a sort of a test tube, a kind of petri dish for some of the worst tendencies of post-humanism, to test those out in this country that doesn't really have much of an ethical bulwark against some of the worst elements of it. I think Christianity, in the history of Christianity, maybe not just Christianity, but I think in particular Christianity in Western history, despite Christianity being very weak and dead, there's always tendencies which remain in secular societies. I think those tendencies actually put us in the West again in a better position to resist kind of post-humanist era than in China. But anyway, skipping past that, we'll talk a bit about Russia. Dugin says, Russia has never been just a country, much less just one among other European countries. For all the unity of our roots with Europe, which go back to Greco-Roman culture, Russia, at all stages of its history, has followed its own particular path. This also had an impact on our firm and unwavering choice of orthodoxy and Byzantinism, as in the Byzantine extension of the Roman Empire, in general, which largely determined our estrangement from Western Europe. which chose Catholicism and later Protestantism. In the modern age, the same factor of profound distrust of the West was reflected in the fact that we were not so affected by the very spirit of modernism in nominalism, individualism, and liberalism. And even when we borrowed some doctrines and ideologies from the West, they were often critical, i.e., they contained in themselves the rejection of the main kind of liberal capitalistic way of development of Western European civilization, which was so close to us. So Russia is in a unique position, and I think there is some, like I know Dugin is an ideologue. I know he does engage in what could be objectively called propaganda as well, but he's not wrong, I don't think, about this. Like, Russia is a unique country because it's sort of like this quasi-European country. It's European in its history. It's Christian history. But it chose a different path, as he said, orthodoxy instead of Catholicism, Protestantism. Orthodoxy seems to be today to becoming kind of increasingly popular among people who are quite critical of post-humanist, transhumanist tendencies. I've noticed that among people in the West, they've kind of taken this up. And why that is another good question. Without going on a rant, as someone who's technically Catholic, I'm not a hardcore practicing Catholic or anything, other than occasionally going to mass. It's the Catholic Church has kind of been so subject to so many scandals. It's become such a kind of money grubbing institution. It's become so kind of bloated and just it's difficult to kind of conjure up the spirit, you could say, of the church in order to, I think, leverage some sort of resistance to this post-humanist age. I think Protestantism, you couldn't do that with Protestantism as it is. I personally, well, I don't know, maybe you could. Maybe people out there, Protestants, could argue against this. I'll just speak as someone who's technically Catholic, coming from a Catholic perspective. It does seem like Orthodoxy is somewhat unique, or is in somewhat of a unique historical position. I'll give them that. And Russia kind of having this strange quasi-European in the sense that it's inherited. Dugin is a great admirer of the Greeks, the German idealists, and so on. Being influenced by both Christianity and by history of Western culture and Western philosophy, but sort of always being a bit skeptical and distant from certain elements, particularly with liberalism, capitalism. Obviously, this is why you had the Soviet experiment and so on. This is why, Russia is in quite a unique position. I will give him that. That's true. One other thing he says about Russia, which is very interesting, is this. He says Russia is not the only target of the Great Reset, although in many ways our country is the main obstacle to the execution of their plans. But this is our mission, to be the katechon, the one who withholds, preventing the arrival of the last evil in the world. So I had not came across this term before, katechon, and I looked it up, and it's fascinating. It is a Greek word, as he says, meaning the one who withholds, but it's got a kind of theological context. It's a sort of withholding or resistance or a constraint on, at least in the theological context, the full manifestation of the Antichrist, right? So there's a very eschatological component to this. I suppose you could say he sees the role of the Great Awakening and Russia geopolitically kind of having a special role in that as a kind of catechonic role, to withhold something, to resist and to withhold something which is so awful that you could analogize it to being, or I suppose you could take it literally too if you wanted to, of being an expression of the Antichrist, an emergence of the Antichrist. So I think that this is particularly interesting because some periods in history have a kind of messianic tone to them. There's the arrival of the Messiah, and maybe you could posit the arrival of the Messiah is necessary in order to in order to withhold the Antichrist. But our era does seem to be increasingly being pushed towards a kind of withholding from some sort of like biblical level catastrophe. And I'm not trying to like, say this is just irrational or anything. Like there is something genuine to this, and I think you see this being expressed not just in a kind of a suspicion, I think a justified suspicion of post-humanist tendencies, but also, for example, environmentalism or well, I suppose those two, right? Environmentalism and kind of a resistance to post-humanism. There is definitely an eschatological element to both of these things, although they express themselves in different ways. I think one's a bit more left and one's a bit more right, and so on. But nonetheless, there's something there. So this, I totally recommend this book. It's a short enough book, but it's a great little framework for understanding the past few years that we've gone through. So yeah, that's it. Subscribe. See ya.